Falk was about to go on deck and have it out at once, when he remarked that one of the ports of his cabin commanded the approaches of the fresh-water pump. Instead of going out, he stayed within and secured the door. "The best man shall survive," he said to himself, "and the other," he reasoned, "must at some time or other come there to drink. These starving men would drink often to cheat the pangs of their hunger." But the carpenter, too, must have noticed the position of the port. They were the two best men in the ship, and the game was with them. All the rest of the day, Falk saw no one and heard no sound. At night he strained his eyes. It was dark. He heard a rustling noise once, but he was certain that no one could have come near the pump. It was to the left of his deck port, and he could not have failed to see a man, for the night was clear and starry. He saw nothing. Towards morning another faint noise made him suspicious. Deliberately and quietly he unlocked his door. He had not slept and had not given way to the horror of the situation. He wanted to live. But during the night the carpenter, without even trying to approach the pump, had managed to creep quietly along the starboard bulwark and, unseen, had crouched down right under Falk's deck port. When daylight came, he rose up suddenly, looked in, and putting his arm through the round brass-framed opening, fired at Falk within a foot. He missed, and Falk, instead of attempting to seize the arm holding the weapon, opened his door unexpectedly, and with the muzzle of his revolver nearly touching the other's side, shot him dead. The best man had survived. Both of them had at the beginning just strength enough to stand on their feet, and both had displayed pitiless resolution, endurance, cunning, and courage, all the qualities of classic heroism. At once Falk threw overboard the captain's revolver. He was a born monopolist. Then, after the report of the two shots, followed by a profound silence, there crept out into the cold, cruel dawn of Antarctic regions from various hiding places over the deck of that dismantled corpse of a ship floating on a gray sea, ruled by iron necessity and with a heart of ice, there crept into view one by one, cautious, slow, eager, glaring, and unclean, a band of hungry and livid skeletons. Falk faced them, the possessor of the only firearm on board, and the second best man, the carpenter, was lying dead between him and them. "He was eaten, of course," I said. Falk bent his head slowly, shuddered a little, drawing his hands over his face, and said, "I had never any quarrel with that man, but there were our lives between him and me." Why continue the story of that ship, that story before which, with its fresh-water pump like a spring of death, its man with the weapon, the sea ruled by iron necessity, its spectral band swayed by terror and hope, its mute and unhearing heaven, the fable of the Flying Dutchman with its convention of crime and its sentimental retribution fades like a graceful wreath, like a wisp of white mist? What is there to say that every one of us cannot guess for himself? I believe Falk began by going through the ship, revolver in hand, to annex all the matches. Those starving wretches had plenty of matches. He had no mind to have the ship set on fire under his feet, either from hate or from despair. He lived in the open, camping on the bridge, commanding all the after-deck, and the only approach to the pump. He lived. Some of the others lived, too, concealed, anxious, coming out one by one from their hiding places at the seductive sound of a shot. And he was not selfish. They shared all alike. but only 3 of them all remained alive when a whaler, returning from her cruising ground, nearly ran over the waterlogged hull of the Borgmesterdal, which it seems, in the end, had in some way sprung a leak in both her holds, but being loaded with deals, could not sink. They all died, Falk said, these 3 too afterwards. But I would not die. All died, all under this terrible misfortune. But was I too to throw away my life? Could I? Tell me, Captain. I was alone there, quite alone, just like the others. Each man was alone. Was I to give up my revolver? Who to? Or was I to throw it into the sea? What would have been the good? Only the best man would survive. It was a great, terrible, and cruel misfortune. He had survived. I saw him before me as though preserved for a witness to the mighty truth of an unerring and eternal principle. Great beads of perspiration stood on his forehead, and suddenly it struck the table with a heavy blow as he fell forward, throwing his hands out. "And this is worse," he cried. "This is a worse pain. This is more terrible." He made my heart thump with the profound conviction of his cry, and after he left me to go on board his ship, I called up before my mental eye the image of the girl, weeping silently, abundantly, patiently, and as if irresistibly. I thought of her tawny hair. I thought how, if unplaited, it would have covered her all round, as low as the hips, like the hair of a siren. And she had bewitched him. Fancy a man who would guard his own life with the inflexibility of a pitiless and immovable fate, being brought to lament that once a crowbar had missed his skull. The sirens sing and lure to death, but this one had been weeping silently as if for the pity of his life. She was the tender and voiceless siren of this appalling navigator. He evidently wanted to live his whole conception of life. Nothing else would do. And she, too, was a servant of that life that, in the midst of death, cries aloud to our senses. She was eminently fitted to interpret for him its feminine side, and in her own way, and with her own profusion of sensuous charms, she also seemed to illustrate the eternal truth of an unerring principle. I don't know, though, what sort of principle Hermann illustrated when he turned up early on board my ship with a most perplexed air. It struck me, however, that he, too, would do his best to survive. He seemed greatly calmed on the subject of Falk, but still very full of it. "What is it you said I was last night, you know?" he asked after some preliminary talk. I don't know, a very funny word." "Squeamish?" I suggested. "Yes. What does it mean?" "That you exaggerate things to yourself, without inquiry, and so on." He seemed to turn it over in his mind. He went on talking. This Falk was the plague of his life, upsetting everybody like that. Mrs. Hermann was unwell this morning. His niece was crying still. There was nobody to look after the children. He struck his umbrella on the deck. The girl would be like that for months. Fancy carrying all the way home, second class, a perfectly useless girl who is crying all the time. It was bad for Lena, too, he observed, but on what grounds I could not guess. Perhaps of the bad example. That child was already sorrowing and crying enough over the rag doll. Nicholas was really the least sentimental person of the family. "Why does your niece weep?" I asked. "From pity," cried Hermann. It was impossible to make out women. Mrs. Hermann was the only one he pretended to understand. She was very, very upset and doubtful. Doubtful about what? I asked. He averted his eyes and did not answer this. It was impossible to make women out. For instance, his niece was weeping for Falk. Now he, Hermann, would like to wring his neck. But then he supposed he had too tender a heart. Frankly, he asked at last, what do you think of what we heard last night, Captain? In all these tales, I observed, there is always a good deal of exaggeration, and not letting him recover from his surprise, I assured him that I knew all the details. He begged me not to repeat them. His heart was too tender. They would make him feel unwell. Then, looking at his feet and speaking very slowly, he supposed that he need not see much of them after they were married, for indeed he could not bear the sight of Falk. On the other hand, it was ridiculous to take home a girl with her head turned, a girl that weeps all the time and is of no help to her aunt. Now will you be able to do with one cabin only on your passage home? I said. Yes, I had thought of that, he said brightly, almost. Yes, himself, his wife, 4 children. One cabin might do. Whereas if his niece went— What does Mrs. Hermann say to it? I inquired. Mrs. Hermann did not know whether a man of that sort could make a girl happy. She had been greatly deceived in Captain Falk. She had passed a very bad night. These good people did not seem to be able to retain an impression for a whole 12 hours. I assured him on my own personal knowledge that Falk possessed in himself all the qualities to make his niece's future prosperous. He said he was glad to hear this, and that he would tell his wife. Then the object of the visit came out. He wished me to help him to resume relations with Falk. His niece, he said, had expressed the hope I would do so in my kindness. He was evidently anxious that I should, for though he seemed to have forgotten 9/10 of his last night's opinions, and the whole of his indignation, yet he evidently feared to be sent to the right about. You told me he was very much in love, he concluded slyly, and leered in a sort of bucolic way. As soon as he had left my ship, I called Falk on board by signal, the tug still lying at the anchorage. He took the news with calm gravity, as though he had all along trusted the stars to fight for him in their courses. I saw them once more together, and only once, on the quarter-deck of the Diana. Hermann smoking with a shirt-sleeved elbow hooked over the back of his chair. Mrs. Hermann was sewing alone. As Falk stepped over the gangway, Hermann's niece, with a slight swish of the skirt and a friendly nod to me, glided past my chair. Those two met in sunshine, abreast of the mainmast. He held her hands and looked down at them, and she looked up at him with her candid and unseeing glance. It seemed to me they had come together as if attracted, drawn, and guided to each other by a mysterious influence. They were a complete couple. In her grey frock, palpitating with life, generous of form, Olympian and simple, she was indeed the siren to fascinate that dark navigator, this ruthless lover of the 5 senses. From afar I seemed to feel the masculine strength with which he grasped those hands she had extended to him, with a womanly swiftness. Lena, a little pale, nursing her beloved lump of dirty rags, ran towards her big friend, and then, in the drowsy silence of the good old ship, Mrs. Hermann's voice rang out so changed that it made me spin round in my chair to see what was the matter. "Lena, come here!" she screamed, and this good-natured matron gave me a wavering glance, dark and full of fearsome distrust. The child ran back, surprised, to her knee. But the two, standing before each other in sunlight with clasped hands, had heard nothing, had seen nothing, and no one. 3 feet away from them in the shade, a seaman sat on a spar, very busy, splicing a strop and dipping his fingers into a tar pot, as if utterly unaware of their existence. When I returned in command of another vessel some 5 years afterwards, Mr. and Mrs. Falk had left the place. I shouldn't wonder if Schomberg's tongue had succeeded at last in scaring Falk away for good. And indubitably there was some vague tale still going about the town of a certain Falk, owner of a tug, who had won his wife at cards from the captain of an English ship. This concludes the reading of Falk, a Reminiscence. The reading of The Warrior's Soul follows immediately. The Warrior's Soul. The old officer with long white mustaches gave rein to his indignation. "Is it possible that you youngsters should have no more sense than that? Some of you had better wipe the milk off your upper lip before you start to pass judgment on the few poor stragglers of a generation which has done and suffered not a little in its time." His hearers having expressed much compunction, the ancient warrior became appeased. But he was not silenced. "I am one of them, one of the stragglers, I mean," he went on patiently. "And what did we do? What have we achieved? He, the great Napoleon, started upon us to emulate the Macedonian Alexander with a rock of nations at his back. We opposed empty spaces to French impetuosity. Then we offered them an interminable battle so that their army went at last to sleep in its positions, lying down on the heaps of its own dead. Then came the wall of fire in Moscow. It toppled down on them. Then began the long rout of the Grand Army. I have seen it stream on like the doomed flight of haggard, spectral sinners across the innermost frozen circle of Dante's Inferno, ever widening before their despairing eyes. They who escaped must have had their souls doubly riveted inside their bodies to carry them out of Russia through that frost fit to split rocks. But to say that it was our fault that a single one of them got away is mere ignorance. Why, our own men suffered nearly to the limit of their strength, their Russian strength. Of course, our spirit was not broken. And then our cause was good. It was holy. But that did not temper the wind much to men and horses. The flesh is weak, good or evil purpose. Humanity has to pay the price. Why, in that very fight for that little village of which I have been telling you, we were fighting for the shelter of those old houses as much as victory. And with the French it was the same. It wasn't for the sake of glory or for the sake of strategy. The French knew that they would have to retreat before morning, and we knew perfectly well that they would go. As far as the war was concerned, there was nothing to fight about. Yet our infantry and theirs fought like wildcats, or like heroes, if you like that better, amongst the houses. Hot work enough, while the supports out in the open stood freezing in a tempestuous north wind which drove the snow on earth and the great masses of clouds in the sky at a terrific pace. The very air was inexpressibly somber by contrast with the white earth. I have never seen God's creation look more sinister than on that day. We, the cavalry, we were only a handful, had not much to do except turn our backs to the wind and receive some stray French round shot. This I may tell you, was the last of the French guns, and it was the last time they had their artillery in position. Those guns never went away from there either. We found them abandoned next morning. But that afternoon they were keeping up an infernal fire on our attacking columns. The furious wind carried away the smoke and even the noise, but we could see the constant flicker of the tongues of fire along the French front. Then a driving flurry of snow would hide everything except the dark red flashes in the white swirl. At intervals, when the line cleared, we could see away across the plain to the right a somber column moving endlessly, the great rout of the Grand Army creeping on and on all the time, while the fight on our left went on with a great din and fury. The cruel whirlwind of snow swept over that scene of death and desolation, and then the wind fell as suddenly as it had arisen in the morning. Presently we got orders to charge the retreating column. I don't know why, unless they wanted to prevent us from getting frozen in our saddles by giving us something to do. We changed front half right and got into motion at a walk to take that distant dark line in flank. It might have been 2:30 in the afternoon. You must know that so far in this campaign my regiment had never been on the main line of Napoleon's advance. All these months since the invasion, the army we belonged to had been wrestling with Oudinot in the north. We had only come down lately, driving him before us to the Berezina. This was the first occasion, then, that I and my comrades had a close view of Napoleon's Grand Army. It was an amazing and terrible sight. I had heard of it from others. I had seen the stragglers from it, small bands of marauders, parties of prisoners in the distance. But this was the very column itself, a crawling, stumbling, starved, half-demented mob. It issued from the forest a mile away, and its head was lost in the murk of the fields. We rode into it at a trot, which was the most we could get out of our horses, and we stuck in that human mass as if in a moving bog. There was no resistance. I heard a few shots, 6 perhaps. Their very senses seemed frozen within them. I had time for a good look while riding at the head of my squadron. Well, I assure you, there were men walking on the outer edge, so lost to everything but their misery that they never turned their heads to look at our charge. Soldiers! My horse pushed over one of them with his chest. The poor wretch had a dragoon's blue cloak, all torn and scorched, hanging from his shoulders, and he didn't even put his hand out to snatch at my bridle and save himself. He just went down. Our troopers were pointing and slashing, well, and of course at first I myself. What would you have? An enemy is an enemy. Yet a sort of sickening awe crept into my heart. There was no tumult. Only a low, deep murmur dwelt over them, interspersed with louder cries and groans, while that mob kept on pushing and surging past us, sightless and without feeling. A smell of scorched rags and festering wounds hung in the air. My horse staggered in the eddies of swaying men, but it was like cutting down galvanized corpses that didn't care. Invaders, yes, God was already dealing with them. I touched my horse with the spurs to get clear. There was a sudden rush and a sort of angry moan when our second squadron got into them on our right. My horse plunged and somebody got hold of my leg. As I had no mind to get pulled out of my saddle, I gave a backhanded slash without looking. I heard a cry and my leg was let go suddenly. Just then I caught sight of the subaltern of my troop at some little distance from me. His name was Tomasov. That multitude of resurrected bodies with glassy eyes was seething round his horse as if blind, growling crazily. He was sitting erect in his saddle, not looking down at them, and sheathing his sword deliberately. This Tomasov, well, he had a beard. Of course, we all had beards then. Circumstances, lack of leisure, want of razors too. No, seriously, we were a wild-looking lot in those unfortunate days, which so very many of us did not survive. You know our losses were awful, too. Yes, we looked wild. Des Russes sauvages, what? So, he had a beard, this Tomasov, I mean, but he did not look sauvage. He was the youngest of us all, and that meant real youth. At a distance he passed muster fairly well, what with the grime and the particular stamp of that campaign on our faces. But directly you were near enough to have a good look into his eyes, that was where his lack of age showed. Though he was not exactly a boy. Those same eyes were blue, something like the blue of autumn skies, dreamy and gay, too. Innocent, believing eyes. A top-knot of fair hair decorated his brow, like a gold diadem in what one would call normal times. You may think I am talking of him as if he were the hero of a novel. Why, that's nothing to what the adjutant discovered about him. He discovered that he had a lover's lips, whatever that may be. If the adjutant meant a nice mouth, why, it was nice enough. But of course it was intended for a sneer. That adjutant of ours was not a very delicate fellow. Look at those lover's lips, he would exclaim in a loud tone while Tomasov was talking. Tomasov didn't quite like that sort of thing. But to a certain extent he had laid himself open to banter by the lasting character of his impressions, which were connected with the passion of love, and perhaps were not of such a rare kind as he seemed to think them. What made his comrades tolerant of his rhapsodies was the fact that they were connected with France, with Paris. You, of the present generation, you cannot conceive how much prestige there was then in those names for the whole world. Paris was the center of wonder for all human beings gifted with imagination. There we were, the majority of us young and well-connected, but not long out of our hereditary nests in the provinces. Simple servants of God, mere rustics, if I may say so. So we were only too ready to listen to the tales of France from our comrade Tomasov. He had been attached to our mission in Paris the year before the war. High protections, very likely, or maybe sheer luck. I don't think he could have been a very useful member of the mission because of his youth and complete inexperience. And apparently all his time in Paris was his own. The use he made of it was to fall in love, to remain in that state, to cultivate it, to exist only for it, in a manner of speaking. Thus it was something more than a mere memory that he had brought with him from France. Memory is a fugitive thing. It can be falsified, it can be effaced, it can even be doubted. Why, I myself came to doubt sometimes that I too have been in Paris in my turn, and the long road there with battles for its stages would appear still more incredible if it were not for a certain musket ball which I have been carrying about my person ever since a little cavalry affair which happened in Silesia at the very beginning of the Leipzig campaign. Passages of love, however, are more impressive, perhaps, than passages of danger. You don't go affronting love in troops, as it were. They are rarer, more personal, and more intimate. And remember that with Tomasov all that was very fresh yet. He had not been home from France 3 months when the war began. His heart, his mind were full of that experience. He was really awed by it, and he was simple enough to let it appear in his speeches. He considered himself a sort of privileged person, not because a woman had looked at him with favor, but simply because, how should I say it, he had had the wonderful illumination of his worship for her, as if it were heaven itself that had done this for him. Oh, yes, he was very simple, a nice youngster, yet no fool, and with that utterly inexperienced, unsuspicious, and unthinking. You will find one like that here and there in the provinces. He had some poetry in him, too. It could only be natural, something quite his own, not acquired. I suppose Father Adam had some poetry in him of that natural sort. For the rest, une rousse sauvage, as the French sometimes call us, but not of that kind which they maintain eats tallow candle for a delicacy. As to the woman, the French woman, well, though I have also been in France with 100,000 Russians, I have never seen her. Very likely she was not in Paris then, and in any case hers were not the doors that would fly open before simple fellows of my sort, you understand. Gilded salons were never in my way. I could not tell you how she looked, which is strange, considering that I was, if I may say so, Tomasov's special confidant. He very soon got shy of talking before the others. I suppose the usual campfire comments jarred his fine feelings. But I was left to him, and truly I had to submit. You can't very well expect a youngster in Tomasov's state to hold his tongue altogether. And I suppose you will hardly believe me, I am, by nature, a rather silent sort of person. Very likely my silence appeared to him sympathetic. All the month of September our regiment quartered in villages had come in for an easy time. It was then that I heard most of that. You can't call it a story. The story I have in my mind is not in that. Outpourings, let us call them. I would sit content to hold my peace, a whole hour perhaps, while Tomasov talked with exultation, and when he was done I would still hold my peace. And then there would be produced a solemn effect of silence, which I imagine pleased Tomasov in a way. She was, of course, not a woman in her first youth, a widow maybe. At any rate, I never heard Tomasov mention her husband. She had a salon, something very distinguished, a social center in which she queened it with great splendor. Somehow I fancy her court was composed mostly of men. But Tomasov, I must say, kept such details out of his discourses wonderfully well. Upon my word, I don't know whether her hair was dark or fair, her eyes brown or blue. What was her stature, her features, or her complexion? His love soared above mere physical impressions. He never described her to me in set terms, but he was ready to swear that in her presence everybody's thoughts and feelings were bound to circle round her. She was that sort of woman. Most wonderful conversations on all sorts of subjects went on in her salon, but through them all there flowed unheard, like a mysterious strain of music, the assertion, the power, the tyranny of sheer beauty. So apparently the woman was beautiful. She detached all these talking people from their life interests and even from their vanities. She was a secret delight and a secret trouble. All the men, when they looked at her, fell to brooding, as if struck by the thought that their lives had been wasted. She was the very joy and shudder of felicity, and she brought only sadness and torment to the hearts of men. In short, she must have been an extraordinary woman, or else Tomasov was an extraordinary young fellow to feel in that way, and to talk like this about her. I told you the fellow had a lot of poetry in him, and observed that all this sounded true enough. It would be just about this sorcery a woman very much out of the common would exercise, you know. Poets do get close to truth somehow, there is no denying that. There is no poetry in my composition, I know, but I have my share of common shrewdness, and I have no doubt that the lady was kind to the youngster once he did find his way inside her salon. His getting in is the real marvel. However, he did get in, the innocent, and he found himself in distinguished company there amongst men of considerable position. And you know what that means. Thick waists, bald heads, teeth that are not, as some satirist puts it. Imagine amongst them a nice boy, fresh and simple, like an apple just off the tree. A modest, good-looking, impressionable, adoring young barbarian. My word, what a change! What a relief for jaded feelings! And with that, having in his nature that dose of poetry which saves even a simpleton from being a fool. He became an artlessly, unconditionally devoted slave. He was rewarded by being smiled on, and in time admitted to the intimacy of the house. It may be that the unsophisticated young barbarian amused the exquisite lady. Perhaps, since he didn't feed on tallow candles, he satisfied some need of tenderness in the woman. You know, there are many kinds of tenderness highly civilized women are capable of. Women with heads and imagination, I mean, and no temperament to speak of, you understand. But who is going to fathom their needs or their fancies? Most of the time, they themselves don't know much about their innermost moods, and blunder out of one into another, sometimes with catastrophic results. And then who is more surprised than they? However, Tomasov's case was in its nature quite idyllic. The fashionable world was amused. His devotion made for him a kind of social success, but he didn't care. There was his one divinity, and there was the shrine where he was permitted to go in and out without regard for official reception hours. He took advantage of that privilege freely. Well, he had no official duties, you know. The military mission was supposed to be more complimentary than anything else, the head of it being a personal friend of our Emperor Alexander, and he too was laying himself out for successes in fashionable life exclusively, as it seemed. One afternoon, Tomasov called on the mistress of his thoughts earlier than usual. She was not alone. There was a man with her, not one of the thick-waisted, bald-headed personages, but a somebody all the same, a man over 30, a French officer who to some extent was also a privileged intimate. Tomasov was not jealous of him. Such a sentiment would have appeared presumptuous to the simple fellow. On the contrary, he admired that officer. You have no idea of the French military men's prestige in those days, even with us Russian soldiers who had managed to face them perhaps better than the rest. Victory had marked them on the forehead, it seemed, forever. They would have been more than human if they had not been conscious of it. But they were good comrades and had a sort of brotherly feeling for all who bore arms, even if it was against them. And this was quite a superior example, an officer of the Major General's staff, and a man of the best society besides. He was powerfully built and thoroughly masculine, though he was as carefully groomed as a woman. He had the courteous self-possession of a man of the world. His forehead, white as alabaster, contrasted impressively with the healthy color of his face. I don't know whether he was jealous of Tomasov, but I suspect that he might have been a little annoyed at him as a sort of walking absurdity of the sentimental order. But these men of the world are impenetrable, and outwardly he condescended to recognize Tomasov's existence even more distinctly than was strictly necessary. Once or twice he had offered him some useful worldly advice with perfect tact and delicacy. Tomasov was completely conquered by that evidence of kindness under the cold polish of the best society. Tomasov, introduced into the petit salon, found these two exquisite people sitting on a sofa together, and had the feeling of having interrupted some special conversation. They looked at him strangely, he thought, but he was not given to understand that he had intruded. After a time, the lady said to the officer, his name was Ducastel, "I wish you would take the trouble to ascertain the exact truth as to that rumor." "It's much more than a mere rumor," remarked the officer. But he got up submissively and went out. The lady turned to Tomasov and said, "You may stay with me." This express command made him supremely happy, though as a matter of fact he had had no idea of going. She regarded him with her kindly glances, which made something glow and expand within his chest. It was a delicious feeling, even though it did cut one's breath short now and then. Ecstatically he drank in the sound of her tranquil, seductive talk, full of innocent gaiety and of spiritual quietude. His passion appeared to him to flame up and envelop her in blue, fiery tongues, from head to foot, and over her head, while her soul reposed in the center like a big white rose. Good, this. He told me many other things like that, but this is the one I remember. He himself remembered everything, because these were the last memories of that woman.